The title of today's lecture is Measuring the Size of the Economy, GDP. And here are some of the motivating factors for this. So why do we try to measure? Now, first question we need to ask, how large is the US economy? And to answer this question, we need to have some kind of measurement. In addition, we also need to ask, how do we know if the economy is doing well? Because often in popular news, you hear that economy is doing great. For example, right now in the US, economy is doing really, really good. But if you go back 10 years when we had the Great Recession of 2007, 2009, it was pretty bad. Now the question is, how do you know, or how do we can say that if the economy is doing well or not? To answer these questions, we first need to measure the size of the economy, and it is measured through something called the gross domestic product, or GDP. Now, what is GDP? GDP is the value of the output of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given year. Now, keywords are value of the output, final goods and services in a country in a given year. So that means that it has a geographical connotation as in country, like in the US. It has a time connotation as in the year, and also it includes only final goods and services, which I'll explain later. What does it mean? It is a pretty good measure of the size of the nation's overall economy. How big is the economy? If we know the size, then we can say that US economy is doing good or bad based on this size. Now let me the US GDP. This is the US GDP starting from 1947 to 2017. And in 1947, the US GDP was $243 billion. As of 2017, it is standing at 19,960 billion, which is like $19.6 trillion, which is a big increase over a period of last 60 years. Now, question is that how do we measure all these things? How do we really measure the GDP of the United States? And economists have been able to find it out doing three different ways. So GDP can be measured in three different ways. One is GDP can be measured from the components of demand, which is also called the demand side. That means anything that's been consumed in a country is the demand side of the economy. So you can measure like how much as a country consume, and we can all add it up, and we can get the measure of the GDP. If there's a consumption, there has to be production, right? You cannot consume unless you produce. So GDP can also be measured from the supply side or the production side. And there's a third way to measure GDP, which is called the income side, which is based on how much income people make. So in this lecture, we are going to first focus on the GDP on the demand side. Demand for production can be divided into four main parts. First part is consumer spending. That's the consumption, also represented by big C, that I'll use big C later on. This is the consumption by people like you and me. When I go out and buy a burger, that's consumption because I eat it and that's it. And that's also final consumption. If you buy a laptop, that's part of consumer spending because you are using it for own personal use. Now, the goods and services not only consumed by the consumers, there's also consumed by the business spending. This is also called investment, or I'll represent it by big I. These are the business spendings. That's basically buying machineries, building tools, factories, all these sorts of things. Then there's a government spending. Government is a big consumer. And finally, there's a net exports, which is primarily our trade with the rest of the world. And net exports is shown by NX, and is nothing but export minus import. US GDP can be summed up as C plus I plus G plus NX. So if you just add these things, four things up, you will get the GDP of any country, not only United States. So these are the components of GDP from the demand side as of 2016. So you can see consumption is worth 12,820 billions of dollars. Investment is little over $3,000. Look at the government expenditure. Our government spent almost $3,267 billion, which is like $3.2 trillion. Now we have a net export, which is negative 521 billion, and I explain later like why this is negative. And finally, we have the GDP. Just add up this consumption plus investment plus expenditure, and all you get is your GDP as of 2016, which was $18,624 billion. And this is the components of your GDP as share of the pie, and you can see the biggest portion is our consumption, which is close to 69%, which is followed by government expenditure, then investments, and net exports is typically a smaller part. But always remember the biggest portion of our GDP, the goods and services that we consume. So now let's focus on some of the components and what does it include. So consumption, these are nothing but the spending by households on goods and services. Mind you, GDP is not only the burgers you consume, but also the services of the McDonald's or any burger selling joint. Or for example, right now when you are listening to this lecture and you are paying Sienna, you are consuming a service, not a good. So moment you spend money on Sienna tuition, that's part of consumption. Now only one thing that's not considered as consumption is purchase of new housing. New housing is not part of consumption. Next important thing is investment. This includes spending on capital equipment, inventories, and structures, including new housing. So this typically includes basically if you're running a business and you're buying a truck, you're buying machineries, you are building factories, all these are part of investment. And also household purchase of new housing is part of investment. Mind you, it's not part of consumption. That's followed by government purchases. These are spending on goods and services by the local, state, and federal government. However, it does not include certain things, and it does not include transfer payments. And these are unilateral transfers made by the government to its citizens or individuals in a country. And this typically includes welfare payments, social security, unemployment benefits. And the reason they are not included in government purchases in the current year because these are not part of current production of goods and services. And finally, we have net exports, which is exports minus imports. And if we have a trade surplus, when country's exports is larger than its import, that means it's positive. On the other hand, if the country's imports exceed exports, then it is trade deficit, which is the case, by the way, when I showed you that US has a negative trade net exports, because we run a trade deficit, and that's a big issue in the current economy.